Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle Show, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books of philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. If you'd like to contact us or make comments, suggestions about our programs, just give us an email at chrisangle1@gmail.com. Along with me is my colleague and co-host, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale and is an independent venture capitalist. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle program is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media and secondarily use those definitions to understand the righteousness and ethical superiority of conservative positions. So this week we're going to discuss the university admission scandal, where parents have attempted, or actually have, bribed athletic officials at universities to give athletic preference for admissions purposes to their kids when they actually deserved no admission preference for athletics. It's obviously an unethical situation, as ethics. So we should probably define ethics. We're going to define it as the appropriate dispensation of respect. And this athletic case is obviously an unethical matter. The admissions policy of the universities should be respected by all those involved, whether it's the admissions officers or anybody on the university staff and the people who apply to the universities. And obviously the parents who made these bribes were unethical in their decisional process, because they applied the ends justifies the means philosophy, which is in actuality a lack of any ethics at all. But to discuss this a little bit more, since Rick graduated from Yale and is interested in this particular incident, let's hear from Rick and see what he has to say about this admission scandals. Rick, what do you think?
Well, I think on the one hand, it is a rational response to a system which has many sources of distortion. We know there are quotas that apply to different racial and ethnic groups at the leading universities. They aren't necessarily published, but they're certainly there. And so, for parents who are seeking to somehow find a way into these places or for their children, and knowing that there are all kinds of special dispensations given to individuals who qualify under one rubric or another, whether they're handicapped or of a certain race or whatever it is, naturally or an athlete, naturally the temptation is to find one of those avenues to exploit. So I guess the first point I would make is that where you have these sorts of distortions, where the process is actually very opaque, from many points of view, the whole pricing phenomenon at universities now, as regards tuition, is extremely opaque. Rarely do people pay the same price, right? They are awarded scholarships or special benefits according to a very complex, opaque system that rarely sees the light of day. And as more information, in this ongoing investigation, which will continue, I suspect, for quite some time, comes out, we're discovering that the dishonesty has all the dimensions one could possibly imagine. It just came out in the Wall Street Journal, for example, that certain kids were labeling themselves as black or non-white in order to gain advantage on that score. You mentioned the fact that kids were applying under different athletic considerations, even though they'd never played the sport. There are other cases where kids have hired under the handicap rubric, right? In other words, because there are now special conditions under which you can take the SAT or ACT, if you declare yourself handicapped, they've been able to cleverly use other people to take those tests for them, or to have the test graded by someone who gives them an advantage. So the many manifestations of this are slowly coming out. It's obvious this is endemic. This is not limited to one university. Yale and Stanford are probably the most prominent to get that attention, but it's hard to imagine that similar sorts of incidents won't be found at any of the competitive schools where people are willing to put up some money, a limited amount of money actually, in the greater scheme of things, to get their child into the school. When you compare that to, say, 6.5 million, which is what a Chinese family donated to one of Mark Singer's foundations, when you compare that to the cost of naming a building like at Yale or anywhere else, which could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, it's it's kind of a bargain. What's really more shocking is the lack of mea culpa publicly. There have been a few instances where coaches have been exited. I've heard of no dean of undergraduate admissions being fired or resigning, which is remarkable. If that indeed is a core oversight responsibility, you would think, at a minimum, they would be fired on the spot. I mean, where is the scope for zero tolerance here with documented dishonesty? The university subscribed to zero tolerance, under the provisions of Title IX, or at least during the Obama administration, when kids were accused of some sort of sexual depredation. They were strung up by a kangaroo court and expelled in short order. This has happened. It's happened at Yale. It's happened in a lot of places. It's documented. But here, where you have actual dishonesty, where people are cheating on tests, where they're lying about their athletic qualifications or whether they're ever part of a sport, where they're lying about their race, we don't see really much in the way of consequences. You would think, following these latest news items coming out of the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, that there will be a raft of kids that would have been expelled for even being suspected of this stuff. But no, there have been actually limited expulsions. I've heard of no degrees rescinded. You would think that would be happening apace. You would think that there would be independent bodies brought in to examine what's going on at these universities. In the case of Yale, there is no independent body being brought in to look at the evidence and vet the lack of controls at the admissions department. It's all being done internally, and one would suspect that because it's all being conducted internally, that you've got an administration in the midst of a fundamental conflict of interest that is to say, protecting itself and attempting to protect its reputation. And so, the risk that guilty parties won't be revealed is extremely high. I've heard of none of the board of trustees at these universities taking any responsibility for this. You could argue that in a private setting, if this kind of thing were to happen, the CEO would be at risk, might resign, should resign, or be fired. The board of trustees would certainly be suspect in terms of their lack of oversight. All of these moving parts that one would expect to be accountable in what is by far the worst scandal in a few generations. You would think that all of those moving parts would be brought to light, they'd be exposed, they'd be affected, they'd be resigning, they'd be taking, there'd be some accountability, they would at least apologize for what has happened, but no.
Hey, Rick, you mentioned something about students lying about race in order to get preference. Is one race better than another?
Well, the article in the journal pointed to I don't remember the school in particular, but the child was white and had claimed he was black. And of course, I guess there was a comment from the school that, well, it's hard. It's sometimes hard to determine whether someone's white or black. They might be mixed race or something like that. Well, and either they lied or they didn't lie. It's it's a pretty bright line,
It sounds like the subject matter, if it's has to be politically correct in order for it to be volatile at the university level for heads to roll. In other words, if this is probably done by liberal parents, and perhaps that has something to do with before a liberal media administration is probably why it hasn't been swept under the hasn't become prominent amongst the university issues. Well,
look, I don't think you're going to see much in the way of any action taken until the lawsuits start, right? And they will be a tidal wave, right? And what defense will these universities have when parents in large numbers start to sue them for wrongfully denying admission to this or that child? Where will be the defense?
Who will make these lawsuits?
I suspect parents will organize.
I mean, the parents that were left out, their child didn't get in because of preference to another.
Yeah, they'll say, okay, this Chinese girl got in. She was never on this sports team. She never played the sport, and yet you denied my son admission, who actually did play a sport, was actually quite good at it, and had the same SAT scores. So, what gives?
Where does it end?
Yes. So I mean, these lawsuits could stretch on almost indefinitely. And at that point, when it starts to hurt financially, then I think you're going to start to see administrations and boards of trustees taking action. Until then, they're obviously circling the wagons. I've publicly called for the resignation of the president of Yale. I received a form letter back. I've received very little response from anyone in the administration, including the head of the Yale Alumni Association, the Board of Trustees. I circulated that call for resignation there, no response. To me, it looks like a typical cover-up, very typical cover-up.
Okay.
I sent it to the Yale Daily News. They never printed it.
New York Daily News or Yale?
The Yale Daily News.
Yale Daily News. Okay. Rick, thank you for your insight into this problem, and we'll see everybody else on the philosophical angle next week.
Thank you.